And here we go. So again, my name is Ashley. I'm the Volunteer and Outreach Coordinator here at Napa RCD. And for those of you who don't know who we are, resource conservation districts are what's called a special district within the state of California. We're a non-regulatory agency and we do a whole bunch of different things. But overall, it boils down to helping you care for the land, water, soil, and wildlife here in Napa County. I do have an update on our oak plantings. Unfortunately, we have decided to continue postponing all of our oak plantings, in both the ones that were planned for November and for December. It's just not safe for us to gather in groups right now, so we are postponing them. We do have one scheduled in American Canyon for very small groups in February, and we're just going to keep our eye on the entire situation, and if things get better, we'll continue forward with that, and if not, then we will perhaps have to postpone our planting days for the entire season, unfortunately. That being said, we had a huge crop of acorns this year. Thank you to everybody who donated acorns to us, went out and gathered and collected for us and dropped them off at the office. Please don't bring me any more. I am swimming in acorns, and that's a wonderful problem to have, but without our community oak planting days, I don't necessarily have a place to put all of those acorns, and our fridge is full. I have some in my personal fridge here at my house, so don't bring us any more acorns, but if you do have property that could handle a few extra beautiful oak trees, please do let me know, and I would love nothing more than to give you a bunch of acorns, and we even have some cages and things like that that we can give you, and some protocols so that you can have the greatest success possible. We can kind of help. Ooh, that's a great idea. Acorn pancakes is a comment that just came through. It's a lovely idea. But if you do have anybody that you know that is looking for acorns, let me know. I'd love to get together and recommend what acorns they should plant on their property and get them set up with something that would work for them. So do let us know, and keep an eye on the Napa RCD newsletter and our Facebook and our Instagram. And if we end up rescheduling those oak planting days, you know, fingers crossed we can make that happen. But if not, we'll let everybody know in our newsletter how that shakes down. If you're not on our email list, go ahead and send me a message and I can get your email added to that list. So I don't want to go any further without saying thank you to our sponsors. You may notice that those of you who have been with us before, our lovely partner at the Napa County Library, Ann Davis, she is retiring and she is not with us this week. And also the H2O Superhero Grant has now come to a close, so we will not be having the library join us every single time. So that's a little bit sad, but we're excited for Anne to move on to her next chapter in life. So other partners include the Watershed Information and Conservation Council, the Friends of the Napa River, Carolyn Parr Nature Center, Napa, and the Napa Valley Vintners. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to tonight's speaker, Dr. Gordon Walker. I personally followed his Instagram for over a year. This is such a cool place to be in terms of mushrooms and the fungus and things like that that you can find in this area of California. And he's been quite the inspiration to just go outside and see what you can find. So I am super excited to hear what he has to say and look at all of his beautiful photos that I know he's going to share with us. So Gordon, I will go ahead and turn it over to you and have you share your screen. And you are muted right now. You're not allowed to unmute. Let me try. There we go.
There we go. Okay, cool. I couldn't not unmute myself. But hi everybody, I'm Gordon. I will hopefully take you on a tour of the fungal kingdom. Certainly not going to do anything comprehensive because it is just vastly complicated. But I am going to sort of hit some of the high notes and show you guys some of the great edibles that you can be out there finding this time of year. If I had spent a little bit more time, I probably would have tailored this more to even specifically what you can find in Napa. But know that a lot of what I'm showing you is stuff that can be found in certain areas of Napa and or out towards the coast in Sonoma, Mendocino, Humboldt, etc. And really for me, the Napa biome is the oak chaparral. And in some ways that doesn't really hit and turn into sort of mushroom season until almost the spring. Once you get into like February and March, that's when you can really start seeing a lot of the fungi that I'm used to sort of seeing in that live oak chaparral habitat. But I'll show you guys what I have here. If you have questions, ask them in the chat. And then if you want to follow up with me, you can talk to me on social media or email me or all the above. But I will get going here. So this is, just start by showing you guys, this is a visage of fungi. This is one of those archimbolo faces. And I reached out to an artist probably about a year ago. And I was like, hey, I have this idea of making my face out of mushrooms. And he'd done some other really cool portraits like this, but they were with cetacea, like whales. He was a marine biologist and he'd done a lot of sort of marine creatures turned into faces. And I was like, well, would you be willing to do it with mushrooms? And he was like, sure. And I was excited because I was like, I love his style. I love the way he uses value and line art and all this stuff. So we came up with this together. And I sent him this sort of 3/4 view of my face holding a mushroom, and he turned that into a mushroom. And so that is, you know, fascinated by fungi sort of incarnate is that mushroom face. But I put this talk together as sort of a thinking about the transition a little bit from fall into winter. And
one quick question. Can you hit play or hit share? We're seeing your entire layout, not just your slide.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, I forgot to put you guys on. Yes. Put you on whole screen. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, I put this talk together because I was trying to kind of capture some of the fall and the winter season and some of the mushrooms that would show up there. The problem is we didn't get any fall rain. So the fall season is severely stunted. But everything I'm saying now will still be fairly relevant to what's in the winter season. And these are two other little logos that I had done with some artists. And usually what I do with these logos is I reach out to an artist because I love their style and I kind of pitch an idea and I do some sketches and then they reimagine my sketches in their own artistic style. And that was very much the case with this incredible lobster chef, or this parrot mushroom, which is a riff on the wet, gooey green parrot mushroom, which is a kind of waxy cap, but you know, also turned into a parrot. So I have fun with this stuff. If you ever want to follow up on any of these designs, you can find them on my website. Oops. Okay, so my background, I will try to go through this quickly so I don't bore you guys too much, but I am a pseudo-Canadian Bostonian, born in Boston, but to Canadian parents. So if you hear me saying oot and boot, that's what's going on. I went to UC Santa Cruz at age 18 and have been in California since. At Santa Cruz, I got really into yeast and fermentation because I like drinking beer. So I started doing some homebrew, and that fascination in yeast and fermentation led me to UC Davis, where I got a PhD in bio. You know, I did biochemistry in undergrad. I also did biochem at Davis, but I specifically went to Davis because of the focus on food and wine science. And I found a wonderful advisor, Linda Basson, who was an extremely accomplished yeast geneticist and just an all-around really wonderful person and great advisor. And she kind of coached me through grad school. And I often think that if I'd had a different advisor or a different setup, I don't know if I would have made it through the slog. But Linda and I worked well together, and she really inspired me to go out and do a lot more in the world. So after leaving Davis, I spent 2 harvests working at Opus One, where I was doing some sort of independent research coupled with stuff that they were interested in. So it was sort of a parallel interests were running together, and I helped spin them into using some new technologies, which are now being used hopefully across the wine industry. But Opus is again sort of leading the pack on the way that people are adopting new technology in wine. And then after being at Opus, or I guess in between my 2 years at Opus, I followed my partner to New Zealand. She had a winemaking internship in New Zealand. I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come along. And I thought I was going to teach some micro or do something more interesting. Turns out no one there needed a free PhD giving lectures. So I got stir crazy and it rained a lot. I was like, well, I'm just going to go for walks in the rain and see what I can find. And I ran into mushrooms. I ran into a lot of mushrooms, and they were super interesting. And it rekindled this latent childhood fascination that I'd had, because when I was a kid, I found this gigantic puffball that was like the size of my head and was totally in love with it. And my mom knew enough to say, hey, we can take this puffball home, you can eat it. So after that first bite of like sweet, marshmallowy, savory goodness, I was hooked on the concept of mushrooms and mushroom foraging. I did not do that much of it as a kid though. I did get lucky that one year my dad had decided that he wanted to get rid of a stump in the yard. And he looked into what it would take to get it removed, you know, with a guy to come and shovel it up kind of thing. And it was like, I don't know, $2,000 or more. And he was like, I'm not going to afford to pay some guy to pull a stump out of my yard. So he is a microbiologist, and he is a fairly forward-thinking guy. And what he figured out was, he's like, well, I can plug this up with chicken of the woods spawn, and the trunk will take care of itself. So about a year after he plugged it up, we got these gorgeous orange and yellow mushrooms coming out of a stump in the yard, and I was utterly entranced by this. And you know, the color alone was enough to like keep me staring at all day. But my dad's like, you can eat this, and I was like, wow, okay. So we fried some up, and I absolutely loved it. And again, that made a very big impression on me, which kind of died down once I hit my like preteen years. And I think that is a pretty common thing. You hit your preteen years, and suddenly everything you thought was cool as a kid is no longer cool, and you know, you just want to be left alone. But it was through my fascination with yeast and fermentation, and ultimately alcohol, that brought me back to fungi. And that basis of education in yeast and fermentation really helped me key into learning a lot about mushrooms. So when I got back to New Zealand and I kind of reignited that latent fascination, that's where my Fascinated by Fungi account started, and just kind of really evolved from there. So one of the first things I want to draw your guys' attention to is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that I deal with when I'm talking to people about fungi in general. And this is specific to mushrooms. This is, you know, not specific to yeast, or there's hundreds of different kinds of unicellular fungi and things that don't sort of fall under the category of what we think of as mushrooms. But when we are thinking about mushrooms, I want you guys to recognize the difference between mycelium versus a mushroom. And mycelium, this is a quote from the book Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. It's a phenomenal book, and if you want to learn more about fungus, or even if you're looking for a Christmas present, I would 100% recommend go get Merlin's book, Entangled Life. It's a great one. But he has this quote that I really like, which is, the mycelium is a way of life that challenges the animal imagination. And that's because mycelium is this white stuff right here. It is little tendrils of hyphae, fungal cells, that are growing out indeterminately in all directions at all times in 3D space. And a big thing to recognize is that mushrooms live in their food, or at least attached to their food. And so they're not able to like locomote around it. They can't, you know, if you're chewing from one side, it's not like they can walk around the other side and eat it. They have to grow around to it or grow through it. And so mycelium is kind of the perfect medium for them to explore. And it's incredible that mycelium has these parallels with the way that like neurons in our brain might work. But the difference is that mycelium is diffuse intelligence. It's capable of making these incredible network decisions across a vast array, and you know, even, you know, hundreds of feet apart, it can still communicate across this network without a central node. There's no central intelligence. There's no brain. The whole thing itself is kind of like a brain, except with that metaphor, the things fall apart pretty quickly when you start looking at like an animal brain versus what mycelium actually is. Because you can chop and change mycelium. We can take pieces up and throw them elsewhere, and they'll keep growing unaffected after having been disconnected from the whole kind of thing. But mycelium, as challenging as it is to imagine for us as animals to put ourselves in the place of being mycelium, I think it's easy for us to understand mushrooms, because mushrooms are singular. And in a way, mycelium is infinite and plural, and we do not have the mental capabilities to visualize ourselves as being part of the infinite, basically. We like discrete things as human beings, and that's where we really key into mushrooms. So mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of mycelium. And that's an important distinction to draw, because mycelium is kind of like the body, and the mushroom is more like the flower or the fruit. Unlike a flower, or unlike plants, if you do pick the mushroom, you're not harming the actual body. And that's, I mean, there's plenty of plants you can pick flowers and it's fine, but there's many wildflowers and stuff that if you pick the wildflower, you just kill the plant. And so this plays out in the laws that have been enacted for how and when you can forage mushrooms, where people have misunderstood mushrooms as plants, instead of understanding that the mushroom itself is more like a fruit that can be harvested sustainably without actually impacting the organism below. But I just wanted to help you guys sort of understand that difference between mycelium and mushroom, because it is sort of fundamental, and it's certainly going to come up, you know, in this talk. So I want to give you guys an idea. We're going to, after we sort of zoomed in on mycelium and mushrooms, we're going to zoom back out, and we're going to think broad context, big picture. So we're going to look at fungi in these phylogenetic trees. So here's one with like all of life with little animated organisms, and it looks cool. And then here's a more sort of scientific one. And you have bacteria and archaea. So these are microbes that are everywhere doing all sorts of stuff. And then eukarya is sort of where most of the things we think about as life fall into eukarya. You can see here, if we zoom here on animals, fungi, and plants, these are all fairly close to each other compared to everything else. But then animals and fungi are more close to each other than plants. And that's something you'll hear repeated a lot. People will constantly tell you, you know, fungi and animals are more closely related than they are to plants. And that is true, but they're still fairly distantly related. It's not like we evolved directly from fungi. The sort of overlap there comes into play when you think about insects, particularly, and fungi, because insects and fungi both use the polysaccharide chitin in their cell walls. And so that's one of the sort of the key metabolic elements that they have in common. The other thing that's really core to all of this is understanding that plants are what are called anabolic. So plants are building their own sugars with the energy of sunlight, whereas animals and fungi are catabolic. So they're actively breaking stuff down. And in that way, plants and animals are similar, or animals and fungi are similar as well. So with all of this complexity and all this stuff, I'm going to tell you that there's really only two kinds of mushrooms that we care about, certainly from the perspective of mushrooms that we can see and we can eat. And that's Basidiomycota and Ascomycota. So those are phylums that include pretty much all of the mushrooms that we think of as mushrooms. Then there are some other phyla of fungi, but they're generally microscopic and you don't see them. Some of them are aquatic, and then lots of them are just in soil or associated with plants. So let's talk about macrofungi, because we're going to talk about the ones that we can see, not those microscopic ones that don't produce fruiting bodies that we would need DNA or microscopes and stuff to look at. So these are sort of the life strategies, general life strategies that fungi use. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec too, but I just want to give you guys sort of a starting point to understand how fungi relate to their environment. So you have, I should actually change this. It's saprobic, because saprophytic is actually a dated term that means a plant that eats other plants, which doesn't exist. That was sort of a projection that scientists were making back when they didn't understand that fungi were not plants. So saprobic is a slightly better terminology, but that basically means that it is mushroom that eats dead stuff. So this mushroom is eating, you know, wood, fallen leaves. This is a saprobic mushroom. So it's just digesting and turning over organic matter to produce soils. Then there are parasitic fungi. So these fungi are preying on plants or maybe even preying on other mushrooms, and they're drawing their nutrients from a host. And then there's mycorrhizal, which is a little bit more symbiotic in terms of their relationship with their host plant, or, you know, like a host mushroom. And it's not always clear that mushrooms stay in their lanes. Mushrooms love to kind of live across the spectrum, and some fungi will have the capability to be mycorrhizal, and then when their host dies, they become saprophytic. So they'll eat the thing that they were previously sort of living with. And that's a pretty common thing. Fungi love to sample new modes of metabolism that help them survive in different conditions. And it certainly makes sense from an environmental and evolutionary standpoint that they would have the capacity to kind of sample new ways of doing stuff to help them survive. So getting at the two phyla I was talking about, we have Basidiomycetes and Ascomycetes. So Basidiomycetes, otherwise known as club fungi, this has to do with the way that their spores look. Their spores are on sort of a club, and then there's little basidia. These spores are on these little fingers on the end of the club. And Basidiomycetes make up the majority of the mushrooms that we think of as mushrooms. Anything with a cap and a stem, a big polypore. Most of the mushrooms you've seen in your life, almost all the mushrooms you've eaten in your life, have been Basidiomycetes. Ascomycetes their spores come in sort of a sac, what's known as an ascus. So instead of having spores on the end of a basidia, there is a little ascus, and it's full of spores. And so Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the yeast that does fermentation, that makes wine, part of why we're all potentially here in Napa to some degree, is an ascomycete. And so that's something that I was very familiar with from my graduate work, and it was kind of cool to come back into mushrooms and be like, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of other ascomycetes, and they include really cool stuff like morel mushrooms, truffles, cup fungi, There's some other sort of interesting cordyceps fungi are also ascomycetes. So certainly like the basidiomycetes make up the majority of the big fleshy mushrooms that you've seen, but then some of the sort of more weird, off-kilter, and even potentially high-value edibles belong in the ascomycete family, phylum. So a generalized sort of life cycle of the way that fungi do their stuff is they will frequently exist as a diploid, and then they go ahead and make sexual spores, and they send out the sexual spores. And that's, when you're looking at the cap of a mushroom and there's spores coming out of it, or if you've ever made a spore print with a mushroom where you kind of cut the stem off and then you just put the cap on a piece of paper and let the spores deposit, you're looking at sexual spores. There are a lot of fungi that have the capability to not just do sexual reproduction, they also do asexual reproduction, clonal reproduction. And that's, again, it's sort of a bet hedging mechanism that they can use so that if they don't have like a sexual partner, or maybe depending on environmental conditions, they will choose to do asexual reproduction and help them spread over the environment around them, as opposed to doing sexual spores, which are helping to drive differentiation, biodiversity, and sort of evolution. And there are some mushrooms that can do both at the same time. And it's not typical, but it's not rare either. There's this really cool one called Dendrocolibia racemosa, and it is exhibiting both what's called a telomorphic and anamorphic stage at the same time. So it's releasing sexual spores and asexual or clonal spores at the same moment. So from underneath its cap, it's releasing sexual spores, and then from the stipe, it has these little nubbins, and it's releasing asexual spores. And this is a cool mushroom because it's not even one that, I think it grows somewhere between a saprobe and a parasite, because it grows on old moldy mushrooms, and that's the only place you'll find it, is on these old moldy mushrooms. And it's a super tiny mushroom, but it's super cool, and the biology of it just kind of blows my mind. So these are some general fungal life strategies. So I mentioned before that we have sort of saprobic, we have the parasitic, and we have mycorrhizal. So mycorrhizal mushrooms make up the majority of sort of the big, high value, edible, fleshy, delicious mushrooms that we really like, stuff like porcinis and chanterelles. Those are mycorrhizal mushrooms. They live in concert with their host tree, and they're fruiting as a result of their association with their host tree, which means that it's pretty much not impossible, but darn near impossible to culture and grow those mycorrhizal mushrooms, which is part of why we still have a wild mushroom foraging trade, because there's people out there picking chanterelles and porcini and all that kind of stuff and selling it in markets, because it can't just be grown commercially. You have plants that are associated with mushrooms, and this is a really interesting collection of plants called mycoheterotrophs. So this one here is called a ghost pipe, and then this one here is called a snow plant. And there's a whole variety of these crazy alien looking plants, and none of them are green because they're not photosynthetic. Instead, they tap into the mycelium, and they are parasitic on the mycelium. And it's pretty incredible, because these non-photosynthetic plants have gotten rid of the capacity to photosynthesize, and instead pull all of their sugars out of the mushroom, or out of the mycelium. And the mycelium in turn is pulling its sugars from its host tree. So it's this kind of crazy web of the way that carbon and nitrogen are moving through the system. And it was always thought that these mycoheterotrophs were sort of obligate parasites, and they did nothing but parasitize. And now they're actually learning more and more about the ecology of it, and realizing that the flow of carbon from the tree down to the mycelium to the mycoheterotroph is not always unidirectional, and that in fact sometimes depending on the season and the environmental conditions and how many leaves the tree has, the carbon and nitrogen can go in all directions, and there may actually be some severe benefits to having these mycoheterotrophs associated, in that you see more and more mycelium spreading and sort of a larger interconnected network of trees and mycelium. So I digress. That's mycoheterotrophs are really cool. I could do a whole talk on those alone, but we'll come back to this. So thinking about parasites and things that are sort of parasitic, there are fungal parasites. So there is Hypomyces, which is a kind of mold that preys on mushrooms. And usually Hypomyces, when it gets all over a mushroom, turns it totally inedible and kind of gross. But there's another kind of Hypomyces that when it infects a mushroom, turns it into a delicious edible mushroom. Something that was previously an inedible mushroom becomes edible once it's been infected with this parasitic mold. That's a lobster mushroom. I'll talk about that a little later. You have plant pathogens. So this crazy looking thing is called cedar apple rust, or this insane looking corn kernel is wheat lacoche or corn smut. Eustylagomatus, I think is the scientific name, but it's essentially fungal galls that form on corn. And in America, we spray fungicides all over our cornfields to prevent this. And in Mexico, they're actively trying to figure out how to grow more wheat lacoche because it's a great protein source and it's delicious. And it's one of those things that, you know, what's a parasite versus something that's valuable? And it's really just about perspective sometimes, and application. And then there's these are honey mushrooms up here. So these are something I view as one of the hardcore metal parasites of the fungus world. Armillaria or honey mushrooms are super parasitic. They can use weaponized mycelium, known as rhizomorphs, which are these sort of gnarly black threads that will like grow through the soil, and they'll creep up inside the between the bark of the tree and like the xylem and the phloem, and they'll effectively girdle a tree, and then they'll girdle the tree falls over and dies, and then the mushroom eats it. So it's kind of killing and then eating its prey. And these Armillaria honey mushrooms are actually known as meadow makers because they will literally clear entire tracts of forests, leaving behind meadows. And in fact, the world's largest contiguous organism is a huge patch of Armillaria that's up in Oregon somewhere. Pretty cool. And then there's even there's endophytes, and endophytes are super cool. They're fungi that live inside of plant cell, or like between plant cells, sort of in the interstitial space between plant cells that look like this. The fungi will take up residence there. And sometimes those endophytes will have like a version that they can go on and fruit and form a mushroom in another phase of their life. But again, you'll see a lot of things as like an asexual form living as an endophyte in a plant. And then maybe when that plant dies, that mushroom will go into its sexual stage and start producing actual mushrooms instead of being this little endophyte. So fungi are really all over the place, but they are ubiquitous and they're doing a lot of different things. And, you know, I just wanted to kind of give you guys a broad sense of all the things that they're capable of. And I'm not even scratching the surface here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about mushroom cultivation at home, as it's something that I've been doing and people get really excited about it. And I know I sent a couple of mushroom kits to my parents, and they've been sending me pictures every day of the mushrooms that are growing, and sending me pictures of the meals they're making with the mushrooms. And it's, you know, it's nice to sort of feel connected when you're so far away. And I don't get to see my folks this year, so it's good to feel like we're sharing something. So yeah, mushroom kits are a really quick and easy way to just, you get a kit in the mail, and within like a week, usually you've got some pins forming. So it doesn't take long. It's really easy to do. The biggest thing you have to do is just spray them with enough water, or keep them in sort of a humid environment, and not let them get too hot or too cold, which generally if you're inside is not a problem. Because these are kits, so it's usually a block of substrate, which is a fancy way of saying this is a block of sawdust mixed with rice bran, usually hydrated to some particular thing, and then inoculated with the mycelium of a mushroom. It's a pre-inoculated block that shows up, and you basically give it some oxygen and some moisture, and boom, off the mushrooms go. They're ready for it. But because of that, it's only saprobic mushrooms. But there is an incredible variety of delicious saprobic mushrooms that we can grow. So there's at least, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kinds of oyster mushrooms that are out there. There's lion's mane mushrooms, there's shiitakes, there's other saprobic mushrooms you can buy in the store too. I just haven't necessarily always seen them in kits, but there's a real diversity, and there's a lot of companies out there that are now growing and supplying these kits. And so you can find, you know, almost everybody will have an oyster, almost everybody have a lion's mane. And then from company to company, you may find other varieties of even the same species of mushrooms, but different varieties of it, or strains of it, as well as different species. And so it's kind of fun to like try ordering mushrooms from different places and try out kits and see what you like best. And even, you know, I just recently did a giveaway thing with North Spore, so I'm pretty sure I have an active discount code with North Spore if you want to save 10% on their website. I've done kits with Far West Fungi and Nearby Naturals, and I've done the Back to Roots. There's lots of them. You don't need to take my word for it. Go out and try them if you want. They're great. I will say that you're never going to get your full value of money out of a kit, in the sense that if you went to the farmer's market and spent $25 on mushrooms, you'll get more mushrooms than you would if you spent $25 on a kit. But you do get to choose when you want to harvest. You get to watch the mushrooms grow, and you'll usually get 2 or 3 flushes out of a single block. So there is value there. You can, even if you know what you're doing, and I'll show you this in the next slide, you can take your old kits and spin that into new substrate, and then keep growing your own mushrooms based off of, you know, the spawn that you got from one kit. So here is sort of a flow chart for how some mushroom cultivation goes. And I literally just Googled mushroom cultivation flow chart. So you can find these things online pretty easily. But generally you need substrate. And so in the case of like oyster mushrooms, they use straw. You do some sort of sterilization, or it's more of a sanitation step where you're trying to knock down the bioload, the amount of other organisms, molds, fungi, bacteria, et cetera, that could compete. And so the easiest way is just boil it. And that will, for the most part, sanitize, sterilize your substrate. You can do a chemical sterilization. I was reading about this. It was something some guy developed with formaldehyde, and was like, no one is going to have, you know, hundreds of liters of formaldehyde around, so no thanks. There's a really easy sterilization, or that sanitation method that I've done before, where you just take straw and you soak it for like 3 or 4 days till it goes fully anaerobic, and that helps kill off some of the other molds and stuff that would compete. And then you can take that, let it drain off a little bit, and then you can inoculate with like oyster substrate, and you'll get great mushrooms out of it. But basically, it's a process of taking some substrate, doing some sort of sanitation step, making sure it's hydrated, and then, you know, adding your spawn to it and bagging it or putting it in something, letting it myceliate at a relatively warm and humid temperature for anywhere from like a month to 3 months, and then it's ready to fruit. And there's more complicated ways of doing this. If you want to go back to not ordering spawn from a company, but actually having mycelium on plates where you have little bits of, you know, agar, and you can take that off and put that into liquid culture and then inoculate that. There's a lot of different things you can do here. And there's a great book out there called Radical Mycology for anyone who wants to like dive super deep into mushroom cultivation. You can learn so much. But I just wanted to sort of show you guys some of the different things that you can do here. I think this looks like it's sort of particularly with shiitake mushrooms, because you can put them in logs, you can make mounds and bags and wall cultures and trays and all this sorts of stuff. But, so I have not done anything that fancy. I'm lazy and I do grow some mushrooms at home, but I've done like the lowest effort possible. And I've found that they pair really well with gardening. You can order these great mushrooms called wine caps, or Stropharia rugosa annulata. Sometimes I think they're called the king Stropharia, but you can buy a bag of spawn for like, I don't know, is it 25, 40, 30 bucks, somewhere in that range. And it's enough to inoculate your entire yard, basically. And you can just take this grain spawn that's been myceliated, and you can essentially, wine caps are so competitive that they'll take over almost anything. So they will eat virtually any kind of wood chip, virtually any kind of yard waste. They're great for compost because they will just plow through things. Wine caps are what are called a white rot fungi. So white rot fungi tend to have the most powerful enzymes. And so they can eat virtually any substrate. I haven't prepared anything for them. I've just put them on wood chips. I had an arborist come and chip like an entire oak tree into my driveway like 2 years ago, and have finally now moved it all out of my driveway into the backyard. But I've been eating wine caps like pretty much every month, because I just have, you know, supply of oak chips and the wine caps are on it. And I just make sure it's watered, and they kind of do their thing. You can build beds like this little diagram here. That's kind of the best way to do it. I didn't do that. I just threw all of my wood chips in a kiddie pool and mixed them up with a spawn, and I started getting mushrooms. So you can do more or less work depending on how involved you want to be. But it's fairly easy to set up. You can also do stuff where you like get plug spawn, and you put in a bunch of logs and you just make it stay watered, and you'll get mushrooms in some amount of time. So I guess what I want to convince you guys is it's not super hard to get started doing your own mushroom cultivation at home, because you can either do kits or you can kind of mess around in the yard. There's certain types of mushrooms that are going to be much easier to grow in the ways that I'm suggesting, like using oyster mushrooms or the wine caps, because they're very competitive. If you try to grow a more finicky mushroom, it may not work if you're kind of lazy about it. But wine caps and oysters are bomb-proof. They will do their thing. So, okay. The California fall and winter mushroom season. So this is hopefully what you guys are here for. This is where I'm going to teach you about at least some of the edible mushrooms that you can go out and find. So there's a summer and sort of an early fall season, and that's very much dependent on fog and fog drip. So the coastal fog that normally blankets the California coast in September didn't happen this year, and that kind of sucked. I went out a lot and just got completely skunked because there had not been enough moisture. But really, there should be some good stuff out there in the late summer and then into the fall. Ideally, we would have gotten early rains, and then we could have started mushroom season as early as October, but we're like barely in it now, even though it's December. So the fall and winter season is definitely dependent on rain, but it can be inhibited by cold. And that's what happened last year is we got a fair amount of rain in like November, but then December was really cold. So not a lot of stuff started growing until sort of the very end of December, like into January. The habitats that I hunt in is mostly sort of mixed coastal forests. So that is a mixture of Doug fir, tan oak, madrone. That's habitat that I really like hunting around in because you have that diversity of different trees and it gives you a diversity of different mushrooms. Pine forest habitat is great too, the bishop pines. Really wonderful set of different kinds of fungi you can find there. And I love the biodiversity that we have here in California. It affords a chance to find a lot of different kinds of mushrooms, and that gets really exciting. So some of the mushrooms that I have here, this set of 3 right here is what's known as the winter trio. So this is a really good set for beginners to know. These kind of pinkish, tannish, buff ones are hedgehog mushrooms. And underneath, hedgehog mushrooms have tiny little spines. And there's nothing else in the forest that has that kind of pinky color and has little spines underneath. So you're sure if you find something that looks like that, it's a hedgehog mushroom, it's edible, you're good to go. You also have black trumpets, Craterellus. And these can be really hard to see because they're black and you almost don't know that they're there until you step on them. And then you have the yellowfoot chanterelle, which is another Craterellus species. And so these 3 here are all fairly easy to identify, pretty easy to find, and they're absolutely delicious edibles. In fact, they're better than a lot of the mushrooms I think you can even buy in stores. Like I take any 3 of these mushrooms over a porcini, which might cost a lot more per pound kind of thing. And here's my partner and I, this is Thanksgiving like 2 years ago. We did not find that many mushrooms this Thanksgiving, unfortunately, but we had some chanterelles and some pig's ear and a couple of hedgehog mushrooms. That's my partner, Jerry, by the way. I think she's interested in being a board member on the RCD at some point. So if anyone hears that, please talk to Jerry. Let's see. So chanterelles are kind of the gold standard for the edible mushrooms that people, go foraging. They say, well, I've looked for chanterelles and I've eaten chanterelles and I like chanterelles. And chanterelles are great. They are relatively common. They can be pretty big. They're not my favorite mushroom, and I'll say that after I started out loving chanterelles, and after eating a lot more mushrooms, chanterelles are okay, but they taste kind of muddy and they taste like dirt to me a lot of times. People say they're earthy, but I think it's just because they're hard to clean, so there's always some dirt on there. Just is what it is. So anyhow, chanterelles are mycorrhizal, like I said before. They tend to associate with certain trees, so you can find certain species and certain habitats with particular trees. And that's something that you kind of learn over time, like what fits where. They have what are called false gills or ridges. And I hope you can sort of see from the pictures here that they're not long flappy gills like you might see on like a button mushroom you buy in the store. Instead, they're these sort of like short, squat ridges. And if you rub them with your hand, they're not going to bend or break. You can like rub them off, but you can't bend or break them. And that's what a real ridge is versus a gill. They're going to have white spores. They're going to have a white flesh. Sometimes some people say they have a fruity aroma, but again, I think all of the chanterelles we have here on the West Coast just smell like dirt. So don't go on like a fruity aroma as being a characteristic, but they certainly will have bright colors. They're going to usually be fairly bright orange. So much so that if you see one on the forest floor, you might feel like it's calling to you, it's singing to you, because there's such a luminosity to those incredible like orangey chanterelles. We have on the bottom, there's 3 pictures here of Cantharellus formosus, which is probably the most common like Pacific golden chanterelle that you find under mixed Doug fir and lots of different habitats. And again, it can look fairly variable. These are across 3 different seasons in 3 different places, but it's the same mushroom. There's a white species, Cantharellus subalbatus, I think that associates with tan oak and or Doug, well, not Doug fir, maybe just oaks. I think the white chanterelle is my favorite Cantharellus species I've had in California. It's really meaty, it's super good. And then there's also this Cantharellus californicus, which is this big, meaty, heavy. If you find one of these, it's probably going to be 1.5 pounds, but it's also going to be waterlogged. It's going to be muddy. It's probably going to taste like dirt no matter how much you wash it off. So there's some diversity to the different types of chanterelles that are out there, and you know, better or worse depending on what condition you find them in. But like I said, well, I guess I didn't say this. There are some lookalikes. I'll show you guys those so you can be aware of like what's a chanterelle versus a lookalike. And I think this is kind of interesting, because a lot of the other beginner mushrooms don't have toxic lookalikes, but chanterelles do. And yet chanterelles are one of the few species that a lot of beginners are like, oh, I feel comfortable foraging for this because I've seen it. And yet there's two lookalikes. There's more than 2 lookalikes, but here's 2 that are fairly common. So one is the false chanterelle, Hygrophoropsis aurantiaca. So this is a lookalike. It's not toxic and it's edible, but kind of marginal and not super tasty. So these are ones that you'll see when you're out looking for chanterelles, and goodness, you want to find a chanterelle, you'll probably see lots of these and you'll be disappointed by every single one of them. They have the same sort of like lightish, tannish, pinkish color on top, again, variable by environment. They have decurrent gills, and so decurrent gills are gills that run down the stipe. So they look, again, kind of like a chanterelle that has these gills that run down the stipe, except that they have real gills, which means that if you kind of mess around with your finger, you can see them bend and even potentially break as you're you know, messing with them. And these are saprobic. So these are something that grow on duff, on dead wood, on wood chips. It's not associated with any particular kind of tree. It'll just be present in the environment. It also has the cap margins are generally a little bit enrolled, and that's another sort of slightly defining feature that you're not going to see. Well, I don't know if that's that defining. They look different, and the best thing I can say is, instead of reading the difference between fungi, which is a lot of people always ask me, hey, what book should I get? What book should I get? I'm like, don't waste money on a book. There is one very good book for our area, and it's called Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and I would totally recommend that. But almost every other ID book you're going to use is going to have a lot of descriptions, and descriptions for me aren't helpful. I'm a very visual person. So the only way to robustly tell these things apart for me is to look at them and look at a lot of pictures of them. And that is really where you start to tell the difference. And that way, you know, when you're out in the forest, if you see one of those things, you've practiced this sort of visual fingerprint that you can help to use, identify stuff. And you can use the features, you can use an ID key to try to help you figure it out. But ultimately, the assuredness you're going to get is going to come from experience and from just seeing a lot of different photos of things in different states. And that will help you, again, sort of determine you know, what's a real chanterelle versus a false chanterelle. So the one that you want to be really aware of, as in terms of a lookalike for chanterelle, is the jack-o'-lantern. Omphalotus olivascens is the species that we have out here. And this is, in some ways, we're lucky in California because our jack-o'-lantern species is not very bright orange. It's usually kind of a darkish, almost greenish gray orange that shows up. And this, hopefully you can look at this and say, this doesn't look anything like a chanterelle, right? It's, you know, good. Hopefully you're safe. But if you're keying it out, if you're using one of those ID keys and you haven't looked at a lot of photos, you might accidentally identify this as a chanterelle because it is kind of orangey. It has decurrent gills, but it's, first of all, it's growing on wood and not, you know, under specific trees. It has these orangey brownish spores, and it has orange flesh, and it also has a very particular smell. So it's good to recognize these. They're interesting mushrooms. I see a lot of these in Napa. These are very, very common in Napa, especially areas that have been affected by sudden oak death, which is unfortunately, I think, ripping through our oak populations here in Napa. And I actually took out the slide on sudden oak death and disturbance ecology. That's, again, a whole nother talk. Maybe we can come back another time. But these like to grow on dead wood. And so when you have a lot of dead oaks that are dying because they've gotten sudden oak death, you will see a lot more of this jack-o'-lantern mushroom. There is 2 cool things about it. I mean, one side, it's toxic, and not just toxic, it's also carcinogenic. So like, very much avoid eating this mushroom. However, you can handle it just fine because all those things that are toxic about it don't pass the skin barrier. So you can touch it, you can handle it, you're going to be okay. You can use it to dye fabrics, and you can make a great array of different, I think, grays and greens with the mushroom, depending on which type of mordant and the pH of it. They also glow in the dark. And so this is cool. And if you happen to find one of these at a local park, I see a lot of these jack-o'-lanterns at Westwood, because again, I think all the trees at Westwood have sudden oak death. But you can go back in the middle of the night and you can see this thing glowing bright green. And it's going to happen more with like the really old blown out specimens than with the young ones. And so if you want to do this at home, I did this once last year, you can take home a big nasty mushroom. And I just sat in the shed in the backyard in complete darkness for about 5 minutes. And then I was like, holy cow, this thing is so green. And as soon as I tried to take a picture of it, I blinded myself and couldn't capture it. And you need like a long exposure kind of thing to get a nice green shot like this one. But you can see it with the naked eye, which is many other bioluminescent fungi. You have to use a slow exposure camera to actually see it. But this is one you can see with your eye. So pretty cool. So this is the Craterellus genus. So this has the yellowfoot and the black trumpet that I mentioned earlier. These are excellent edible mushrooms. They're plentiful. They're easy to ID. The yellowfoot chanterelle is Craterellus tubiformis. So this is mycorrhizal, but it seems to also be able to grow saprobically. So I've seen it growing in association with particular trees, particularly under huckleberry bushes. It seems to really like that habitat. But it will also grow saprobically. So I've seen it growing out of dead logs and stuff like that too. But you know, they're fairly easy to identify. You can always tear them in half and make sure that they're hollow in the middle, because Craterellus should always be hollow in the middle. And then the black trumpets, we have our own species. It's the Craterellus calicornucopides, and that is mycorrhizal with tan oak. So very specifically, you'll find these in tan oak habitats, and again, under huckleberry bushes. They seem to really like areas where moisture is kind of kept in, and maybe fog drip and stuff is providing a little bit of extra moisture. Hedge hogs. So these are the Hydnum species. And there are multiple different species of hedgehogs. There's the kind of little ones, which are known as belly button hedgehogs. They just changed the name. I think it's Hydnum oregensis now. It used to be a Hydnum umbilicatum for the belly button thing, but taxonomy is sort of changing constantly now. And that's part of why I say don't waste your money on books, because books can't keep up with how fast the taxonomy is changing. But websites and other online resources are generally a little bit better for that. So these mushrooms are great because they have this sort of pinky top and they have little spines underneath. And if you find one of those, they're going to be edible. So you have the belly button hedgehogs, which I like best. I think they have sort of the best nutty, sweet flavor when you cook them up. They're really good texture. There's also the Hydnum repandum, which is a little bit bigger. Sometimes a really long stipe because it's sort of growing out of the duff. And you know, these mushrooms can last in the woods for like 2 or 3 weeks, which is great too, because when you bring them home, they will last 2 or 3 weeks in your fridge too, which is fantastic. Because if you've gone through all the effort to go out and pick a bunch of mushrooms, it sucks if everything goes liquidy in like a day or two and you're like, I don't even have a chance to eat it or cook it. So it's nice to have mushrooms that you know will last at least a week in the fridge before they get kind of, you know, kind of gross. So yeah, again, you can identify these Hydnum species by the teeth underneath. That's a very distinctive trait. Oyster mushroom. So this is another common edible mushroom, and you see these in Napa. I see again at like Westwood and areas where there's lots of dead and dying oaks. I'm pretty sure that lots of these will grow at Skyline, and I'm sure that they're up at both. And I haven't been to a lot of the outdoor spaces in Napa. Potentially, there's still things that I have not been to, but you will find these mushrooms everywhere. They love to grow on dead stuff. And oyster mushrooms are kind of like the weeds of the mushroom world. They will grow anywhere, anytime. They don't really care about season. They just need a little bit of moisture to get going. So the species that we have here in California, at least what's wild, is Pleurotus pulmonarius. So it's a good edible. It's relatively easy to identify. It's pretty common. So this is a saprobic white rot fungi. It seems to like to grow on hardwoods, particularly. So you see it on oaks and tan oaks and stuff like that. It also has sort of decurrent gills. And I don't mean to show you so many things that has examples of these decurrent gills, but it is one of those things you can look for the gills kind of running down into the stipe of the mushroom. There is a lookalike called Crepidotus mollis, which is like a very small version of what looks a lot like an oyster mushroom, but oyster mushrooms have a defined stipe. So they have an actual kind of stem that the mushroom is growing out of. Crepidotus mollis does not have a stem. You could just break it off as like a little shelf. And oyster mushrooms are really cool to me because they are hunters. They live in wood, and wood is not a very good nitrogen source, and so they have to supplement their nitrogen, and they put out these little mycelial lassos into the wood, and when a nematode, which is living in the wood and just jamming and eating its way along, goes and contacts one of these lassos, it constricts and starts sucking all the nitrogen out of the bug. So I just think that's really cool, because like we don't normally think of fungi as being acting like an animal, and here it is literally setting out a trap and waiting for a poor little worm to fall into it so it can suck the nitrogen out of it. And I think that's cool. So yeah, these mushrooms have white spores, decurrent gills. You look for the true stipe, and just be careful you're not harvesting Crepidotus. Crepidotus isn't toxic as far as I know. You probably don't want to eat it. It's not going to taste very good. I know someone last year who contacted me and was like, oh my God, I found a bunch of oyster mushrooms. And then they ate a bunch of Crepidotus, and I was really worried, but apparently they were fine. So just beware. So this is a real crowd favorite, and certainly one of my favorite mushrooms. This is actually, you do find a version of these in Napa. These are candy caps, or Lactarius rubidus. And these are very aromatic edible mushrooms, but people usually don't eat them as mushrooms. They use them more like a seasoning. And that's because the mushroom contains what's called a quabalactone, big word, but it's getting hydrolyzed when you dry it out into a lactone called sodalon. So lactones are aromatic compounds that generally have sort of a warm, round flavor. So your classic lactone is something like vanillin. The flavor of vanilla is a lactone. It's very round and warm, reminds you of like licking an oak barrel. And so sodalon is also a warm, round flavor, but it tastes like maple. And it is literally the flavor that they add to like fake maple syrup. So if you have a thing of Aunt Jemima somewhere in your house, that is corn syrup with sodalon added to it. Interestingly, sodalon also shows up in fenugreek as a spice you see in curry. It shows up in sherry. It's like a fortified wine kind of, an aged wine kind of thing. And yeah, it shows up in maple syrup. So it's pretty cool that you can see the same volatile aroma showing up in lots of different products. But I love these Lactarius rubidus because they don't just smell a little bit like maple, they stink of maple. So you can take a small handful of them, grind them up, and put them in a cheesecake or shortbread or ice cream, and you get this incredible maple flavor transfusing through it. You can put it into ground pork and have like maple breakfast sausage. You can put it in a whiskey and make a really nice, mapley whiskey. It is a really, really cool mushroom. And in Napa, we have a version of it. It's not Lactarius rubidus, but we have another one called Lactarius rufolus, which grows under the coast, under our live oak. And it's not quite as strongly mapley, and it's a little bit more chunky and brittle, but it has decent maple flavor. And I've actually used that one, ground it up and put it in coffee, because it's not quite as powerful as the rubidus, but I don't mind it. It's a good one. So another interesting mushroom you guys keep an eye out for. Here is the lobster mushroom. So this is what I was describing earlier with this mold that infects a mushroom, Hypomyces lactifluorum. So this is not something I've ever seen this far south in Napa. Me finding the pictures you see from here is I found this up in Humboldt. And I think you can find them up in Mendocino, but I think Napa and Sonoma, it's going to be pretty hit or miss as to whether or not you can find these. But it starts out with like a Russula or a Lactarius species as a base. So those are just sort of large, chunky mycorrhizal mushrooms. And they get infected in the soil, potentially sometimes before they even break the surface, with this Hypomyces lactifluorum, which as a spore is an asexual spore living in the dirt. And then when it colonizes the mushroom, it goes into its sexual stage and starts like producing sexual spores. And what it does is it infects the top couple centimeters of the mushroom all the way around. So it turns what is usually like a white mushroom into this crazy orangish reddish mushroom, thus the name lobster mushroom. They also, as they age, they can take on a little bit of a seafoody smell. Usually if you smell that seafoody smell, it's not good anymore. You just have sort of old mushroom. But that is turning basically of inedible or at least not choice mushroom as sort of a boring russula into this gorgeous, high value, highly sought after lobster mushroom. And it changes the entire metabolic output of the mushroom. It changes the spores of the mushroom are not able to disperse because it is sort of parasitically castrated by this mold, and instead the mold takes over the entire surface and starts spitting out its own spores from these tiny little pits that it makes all over the surface of the mushroom. It's kind of hard to see here, but there's tiny little mold pits, and so it's putting out ascomycete spores, even though this mushroom was originally a basidiomycete. So I just think that's kind of cool. As far as I know, I don't think there's any real toxic lookalikes for these, so they're pretty safe if you find them. This is an interesting relationship, and it's certainly one that I see a lot out in the woods this time of year. You have Suillus species. So these are kinds of boletes. Boletes are mushrooms that have pores underneath instead of gills. And boletes are parasitized by Gomphidius or Chroogogomphus. And so these are these kind of slimy mushrooms down here. They're known as pine spikes. So these Suillus species are often known as like slippery jacks is their kind of common name, slippery jacks, and then are parasitized by these pine spikes. And you will almost always find these Suillus are in association with conifers, and then nearby, or even a couple inches away, there'll be Gomphidius or Chroogogomphus that are the parasitic on that mycelium of that Suillus, and so you'll see them fruiting together, and often you'll see them fruiting apart. But sometimes it's almost impossible to tell what species of Suillus you have until you see what species of Chroogogomphus or Gomphidius is growing nearby. And so I think that's kind of cool. And these are all generally edible, but they're not choice edibles. The Suillus tend to be very slippery jacks. There's a few species I like to eat, but they're definitely not beginner mushrooms, and they're not, even experienced mushroom hunters don't necessarily pick and eat these. I happen to like them because I always like to come home with something, and I can always be sure I'll probably find a Suillus to come home with. But I've only eaten a couple pine spikes, and these ones turn black when you cook them, and they're not particularly nice looking. And you can eat them if you want, but it's sort of kind of up to you if you want to take that step or be that exploratory. But it is a cool relationship to keep in mind, that when you see these two things, it's that there's parasitism going on along with that mycorrhizal relationship. So here's another sort of mushroom relationship I want to draw your guys' attention to, because this is part of how you spot the big porcinis, the king boletes. And king boletes are often hidden. They'll be under shrumps, which is a mushroom hump, but they'll be buried under pine needles and stuff like that. And so you might not see them. And especially you might not see them because if there was one there, somebody else probably saw it and took that, but maybe there's still a hidden one. And the markers that you can look for is two species. One is very recognizable, and that is Amanita muscaria, the classic, red and white mushroom that everybody knows. Amanita muscaria grows worldwide. It's mycorrhizal with conifers in particular. It has a bad rap as being toxic, but it's not actually deadly toxic. The worst that Amanita muscaria can do to you is give you some puking, diarrhea, that kind of stuff. And in fact, some people eat Amanita muscaria, and the way you eat it is you boil it twice, because the cap, the red part here, contains a compound called ibotenic acid that makes you quite sick. And you can boil it twice and blow off that ibotenic acid and then eat it like a normal mushroom. And I've even heard in Japan, like normally here on the trails, if you go out hunting for porcini, you'll see all these kicked over Amanita muscaria where people have this stupid muscaria and they kick it aside. In Japan, apparently it's the opposite, in that they kick aside the porcini to go find the Amanita muscaria because they like it so much. It's, cultural attitudes towards a mushroom really like dictate how you feel about stuff. But I think that's interesting. So if you see muscaria and then you see this other mushroom, which is sometimes known as the sweetbread mushroom or the spy, they're basically a little white mushroom that has what's called a farinaceous odor. It has sort of a grain-like odor, a cereal odor. And if you see muscaria and the spy, Clotopilus prenulus, I don't know if I pronounce any of these names correctly. I feel like my ability to pronounce mushroom names has come completely from my own imagination. And it's a little bit like when you read Game of Thrones and then you see the TV show and you realize that all the names are pronounced differently. That's how I feel about it. But anyhow, so if you see these two mushrooms around and you're in pine habitat, you can be almost certain that there's porcini and boletes hiding somewhere. So it's a good idea to like get down your hands and knees and start looking for little shrumps and stuff like that. So just drawing your guys' attention to that relationship. And then we have, this is the king bolete itself, the Boletus edulis. This is a highly regarded edible mushroom. I personally don't like it that much. It tastes bitter to me. So usually I just dry it out and turn it into a powder. But some people love this mushroom. It is like their favorite mushroom. It is super meaty. Again, it tastes bitter to me, so it's not the mushroom that I like to eat that much. And we have two sort of sub varieties here that we get in winter on the coast. You have Boletus edulis var edulis, and that's mycorrhizal with the Sitka spruce, but that tends to be a little further north in Humboldt and up in Oregon. And then closer to like Sonoma, you'll see the Boletus edulis grand edulis, and that's going to be more mycorrhizal with a bishop pine. And yeah, there's small differences in the way they look, but mostly environmental. There is a third species of sort of king bolete that grows here in California. It's called Boletus rex veris, and that grows up in alpine habitats during the spring under fir trees. So here's another really highly regarded edible mushroom, and another one of my favorites. It's the Matsutake, or Tricholoma murulanium. I still can't say that. So it's a top-notch edible, has great texture. It's super dense and solid, and when you run a knife through it, the knife squeaks. And whenever I cut it up on video, people are like, you need to sharpen your knife. And I'm like, no, trust me, my knife is really sharp. This mushroom is just really dense, and so it's like squeaking all the way through. It almost sounds like nails on a chalkboard, but in a good way for me somehow. I don't know. So this is mycorrhizal with tan oak. It can also be mycorrhizal with pine. Generally in our area, you'll find these associated with tan oak, which is again why the sudden oak death disease scares me, because we're losing a lot of our tan oak habitat, which means we're losing Matsutake and black trumpets and a lot of things that associate with tan oak. So it really is something that I'd love to see people take a more active role in doing management of sudden oak death and trying to restore tan oak habitats, because we're seeing the loss of tan oak, we're seeing the loss of biodiversity, and unfortunately loss of mushrooms. But so these Matsutake can be a little tricky to ID for beginners, because there are, generally as a beginner mushroom hunter, you're told to avoid all things that have sort of white gills potentially, because that can get you in trouble when you're thinking about Amanitas. But these will be buried sort of in the duff. They usually have a little bit of a tannish, some kind of tannish color on the top. And if you pull them out, they'll have this sort of sandy stipe on the bottom and some stuff on the stipe. But the biggest way to recognize these mushrooms isn't the look, it's the smell. They have this incredible high note, sort of seafood, cinnamon, red hot, spice, clove. It's almost indescribable to really like try to convey what the smell is. But once you've smelled it, ideally you'll never forget it. And you can actually hunt Matsutake by nose in a way, because you can just walk around the woods and be like, where do I smell that Matsutake? Ah, here's a tan oak. I'm going to get down on my hands and knees and look for little shrumps and find where these mushrooms are. So an interesting thing about these Matsutake is there is a microheterotroph associated with them. And this microheterotroph, the sugar stick, or Allotropa virgata, it's a non-photosynthetic plant that is parasitic solely on the mycelium of Matsutake. And here's a little diagram of kind of how that like carbon flow works with microheterotrophs and the mycorrhizae and stuff. But so it's basically, it's fruiting, the sugar sticks are flowering at a different time of year than when the Matsutake fruits. But you can use, if you've gone out on hikes in the woods and you found like where a sugar stick was, and I found one of these, and I'm going to go back to where I found that last year, and probably about a month, and look for Matsutake. Fingers crossed I'll find something. You can use that as like an indicator. And so this is a good reason that even if it's not mushroom season, but you still want to go out for a hike, you keep your eye out for certain things, and that can give you an idea of maybe where you want to go next mushroom season. And it's really fun to sort of explore those tan oak habitats and try to key into where you want to look next season. So there's also some really interesting science that's been done with Matsutake and lightning strikes. And so this came out of Japan, where Matsutake are incredibly culturally important and incredibly economically important. And they've been watching a massive die-off of, I think their pine species is infected by a similar pine beetle that we have here that's causing a die-off of their pine habitats. And so they're watching this massive drop in Matsutake productivity. And it's not because of over-harvesting, it's because the trees are dying. And that's usually the biggest reason that we're losing fungal biodiversity. It's not that humans are somehow doing damage to the environment by trekking around the woods and pulling mushrooms, which is, again, I think a very human projection to think that we're ruining it, because we've ruined so many other ecosystems. You know, we've ruined the oceans. Everywhere we've gone, we've ruined stuff by pulling things out of it. And yet mushrooms are one of the few things that exist that I think we have the capacity to go harvest and actually be sustainable with, because mushrooms are almost meant to be harvested. They want to be harvested because us as animals messing around with them helps them spread their spores more. Anyhow, so Japan is dealing with the fact that their harvests have been steadily declining, and it's threatened by these invasive pests. And so scientists wanted to ask the question, there'd been some anecdotal observations that lightning strikes could increase the frequency and size of Matsutake. And so these guys basically invented a portable lightning strike machine. And they had a bunch of test plots here in the woods, and they went out and they did, you know, between the trees, they did areas where they treated with lightning strikes or no lightning strikes. And what they saw was, after lightning strike treatments, they saw significantly larger and significantly more mushrooms, which I think is really cool. And there's a lot of interesting biology there to be figured out about how do electrical impulses interact with mycelium, and how does mycelium talk to each other. And again, that Entangled Life book by Merlin Sheldrake I mentioned has a lot. We'll dive into more depth on mycelial interactions, and even mentions this experiment if you want to read more about it. There's still a lot of questions to be answered, but I just thought this was kind of a cool thing. And how often do you see scientists like wheeling along a little mobile lightning strike unit and then getting more mushrooms out of it? So part of me wants to do this, you know, up in the hills of Napa and see if we can get a few more Matsutake going on. Okay, so here is sort of an intermission point, questions, and, you know, again, tips for anyone who wants to get into mushroom hunting. I use the app Seek and iNaturalist. I am a board member on SOMA, the Sonoma Mycological Society or Association. And yeah, don't be afraid to just get in the woods and look for stuff. So yeah, questions. Anyone got anything I can help with?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that have come up. I do also want to mention that we are a little bit over our 1 hour time slot.
We can end here. That's fine. I can.
I also don't want to rush anybody. From the faces that I can see, people don't seem upset by the fact that you're still going. So I don't want to monopolize anyone's time or your time. But just as a marker, we are a little bit over our 1 hour time slot. But so far, we have a couple of questions, and I saw that one person has some show and tell for sure. Question, are there any dangerous lookalikes with hedgehogs?
No, and that's part of why hedgehogs are such great beginner mushrooms, because there are no poisonous, there are other tooth fungi, but they're going to be really, really tough and woody and bitter, but they're not poisonous either. And so you would be very, once you see what they're called Hydnum, those look very, very different from a Hydnum species. So if you find tooth fungi, it's easy to identify most tooth fungi because there's not very many of them. So if you just look up tooth fungi, you'll find one of the ones that you're looking at. But for hedgehogs, there's nothing else that looks like them and it has the little teeth underneath. So you're safe on foraging for hedgehogs.
Awesome. Our next bit, I'm going to try and unmute the Josh Harrington family. They have a prop that they would like to show you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I assume that they want to show you. They brought it with them. So,
oh, goodness.
All right, you should be unmuted.
That's a good one.
We found a big pile of these in the yard. A shrimp.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what it is?
So it was a part of a big cluster.
Yeah, big cluster.
That is 100% an armillaria honey mushroom. And if you have a tree in your yard, I'm sorry, it's dead. If you don't have a tree in your yard, it died already, and the honey mushrooms are eating it. But if you do have a tree in your yard, I apologize to tell you that armillaria means your tree is dead and or dying.
It already died.
Well, there you go. That is probably the #1 most common mushroom that people find in their yards, and they say, what is this huge cluster of mushrooms? And honey mushrooms are okay edibles. I would have put them in this talk, but I was geared towards the coastal stuff. My suggestion with honey mushrooms is that one still looks pretty young. When they get old and blown out and they're white spores all over the place, I don't bother with them. But when the caps are still sort of, cap-like, they haven't gotten completely flat yet. Yeah, like that. You can take the cluster and you can just cut off a bunch of the caps, and then I'll just do a quick boil. So you pop them in, or blanch, boil them, blanch them for like 5-10 minutes, something like that. That'll vastly reduce the volume. So you can fit them all in one Tupperware instead of having like a huge, basket of them in the fridge. And the other thing is honey mushrooms can, for some people, cause mild GI upset. And that's not necessarily, that's not like full on puking. That might just be like, oh, my tummy feels a little weird. But when you boil them, that greatly reduces the chance of having GI upset. And then you pre-cook them, which is the other important part, because a lot of people undercook mushrooms, and making sure your mushrooms are really thoroughly cooked is a great way to avoid any potential GI issues. So yeah, if you guys want to cut a couple off, boil them up, you can put them in stir fries. They're great in soups. They have kind of a slimy texture, but again, it works really well in stir fries and soups. So.
Not eating mushrooms, don't like.
I was about her age when we found our apple tree in the yard died because of honey mushrooms, and we took them into the Harvard Mycological Society. And the whole time I was like, Dad, can I eat these? Can I eat these? Can I eat these? And he was like, no, not yet, not yet, not yet. And finally we had a mycologist ID them, and I was like, can I eat these? And he's like, yeah, fine, okay, you can eat them. And I'm very happy to fry them up in butter and just go ham in a whole pan of them. So.
Well, thank you so much for the show and tell. We'll go on to our next question now. From Deborah, is there a way, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, is there a best way to harvest mushrooms without harming or depleting stock?
Yeah, there's a great article out there that my friend Damon wrote called The Ethics of Mushroom Foraging. And so if you want to read a bit about it, that's one of the things I would go read on. And the rule of thumb with most mushrooms is, if you're out there, leave the old and leave the young. In theory, you want to harvest, no more than about 50%, sometimes even as small as 25% of the total fungal biomass. But that can be really hard, especially with something with Chanterelles, and you're just like, oh my gosh, look at these golden beauties. And I only found like 3 of them. So you're not like, I'm not going to leave all, I'm only going to take 1 out of 3. No, I'm going to take the 3 nice Chanterelles I find. But that does mean that if you find a small one or an old one, or just one that, maybe you have a full basket already, there's no reason to take more than you need. And that's important too, because the 3 places that you can legally forage in California, at least Northern California, are Point Reyes, Salt Point, and Jackson State Forest. And so Point Reyes and Salt Point both have daily limits on the amount that you can take. And so it's good to not exceed that limit. And those limits exist so that people ideally commercial hunters aren't going there and pulling out hundreds of pounds a day. There's a lot of back and forth between people about whether you should pull a mushroom up from the base or you should cut it off. I have seen literally no evidence to say that one is better than the other. So I kind of go situationally. Sometimes if I want to cut it off and I don't want to disturb stuff, I will not cut it off. Sometimes if I can't, get a knife in there easily, I might just pull it out by hand. The thing that I do when I do pull a mushroom out by hand and you're leaving kind of a hole or a crater behind is I'll fill it back in. And even if you take the mushroom and you have junk on the bottom of the mushroom, if you're going to trim it off, I trim that back into the forest floor and generally try to put that back in the hole it came out of and then cover it back up. So that's one of the things I think you can do that can really help preserve mycelium and the integrity and structure of the forest floor.
Our next question is from Connor, and he is wondering if you're leading any of the forays with Soma that are coming up.
I'm doing 1 foray with Soma. I'm not sure the date yet. It was February 7th, but things got shifted around a little bit, so I'm not totally sure. My plan was to do 1. I may, when it's not COVID times, I may do more forays myself. But for the moment, I don't want to deal with liability. I also don't have that many spots I go, so,
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I think everything's kind of on hold for now, unfortunately. I think that's all of the questions that we got. I don't see anything coming in this way either. So it's up to you if you want to kind of end here, or if you want to touch on a couple more things. Let's maybe try and wrap it up in the next 10 minutes, maybe.
Sure. I'm going to run through this really quickly. So we're going to go breakneck speed. Last time I told too many stories. So this time we're just going to blast you with mushrooms. So I'm going to show you guys some of the great California polypores. And polypore mushrooms are very different from like a bolete or there's what are called preformed or determinate mushrooms versus indeterminate. And so preformed mushroom starts as a tiny pin, but it has all the cells of a mushroom and it just gets bigger. Whereas indeterminate mushrooms grow out multiple times in series. And that's really the difference between like a polypore versus like the honey mushroom you guys just showed me. Polypores generally are large, long-lived, persistent. They're pretty easy to identify, and there's lots of good edible ones that are very easy to tell what they are. So the one that grows freaking everywhere in Napa, and if you have eucalyptus trees, I'm almost positive that your eucalyptus tree is infected with this mushroom. This is chicken of the woods, Latiparus gilbertsoni. So it grows on eucalyptus. It also grows on oak. It's a brown rot fungi. It has white spores, super bright yellow pore surface. It seems here in Napa to really, really like the eucalyptus, and I think that's partially because eucalyptus has no inherent defense system against it. So I see like oaks infected, like 1 in 100 oaks will be infected, but like 1 in 5 eucalyptus trees will be infected with this mushroom. And I think that's part of why eucalyptus trees fall over so often, because this mushroom is rotting out the hardwood and causing them to fall over when they're already tall and skinny. It is edible, but you always want to cook it really well. It contains a lot of oxalic acid that can cause pretty severe GI upset. It also, just like 1 in 20 people happens to be weirdly allergic to chicken of the woods and will puke within about 20 minutes of consuming it. So as a result, when you eat chicken of the woods, like start small. You can always eat more, but you can't eat less if you feel sick, right? And I've got on YouTube, I have a bunch of cooking videos of me turning this into like chicken parm and other stuff like that. It's a phenomenal edible mushroom. There are other species. There's Conifercola that grows in conifers, Latiparus sulphurus grows on the East Coast, and Latiparus cincinnatus, which is also an East Coast species that I'm very fond of. We have the beefsteak fungus. This is a really wild, gnarly looking mushroom. Looks like a kidney or a liver, or when it's young, it looks like kind of like a little wet, like red tongue. Grows at the side of a tree. When you cut it, it looks like raw beef or like sliced meat. It has tiny tubes underneath. It's just a wild mushroom. You can eat little bits of it raw. It has kind of a sour, lemony flavor because it has oxalic acid. But it's a really cool one. Unfortunately, it's hard to cultivate. So we haven't, like, I swear if we could cultivate this, we would be, because it looks exactly like steak and people would go bananas for it. It's a wild one. So yeah, I can slice it kind of very, very thin and serve it with a little olive oil, lemon juice, and serve it as carpaccio, or I've fried it up and put it in tacos and enchiladas and virtually anything. It's good. It's kind of crunchy. Lion's mane, Hericium arenaceus. So this is one of my favorite edible mushrooms. They're pretty common here in Napa. Again, the areas with like oak, dead and dying oaks, where you'd find the oyster mushrooms or the jack-o'-lanterns, you'll find lion's mane, usually in the little like margins of a tree, place where the branch broke off or something like that. You'll see a lion's mane grown out. And there's another species too of Hericium called Hericium coralloides, and you'll see that as well. It's a little bit more branched, less central structure. But these also have little teeth. You can cultivate these, so you can buy this as a kit. It's super delicious, great versatile culinary mushroom. There's a video of me on YouTube using it to make tikka masala. It's thrown around a lot as a medicinal mushroom because supposedly there's compounds in there that in an in vitro system they've shown it can stimulate nerve growth. But there's very little clinical evidence to actually back that up. And so I see people a lot who are selling nutraceuticals. So these are mushroom products that they're trying to convince you can like save your brain function if you spend $50 on these little pills. And I always tell people, don't waste $50 on dried pills or an extract. Go and buy $50 worth of lion's mane. You can get lion's mane locally, or you can buy kits and then just eat it. It's kind of like the difference between like juicing versus actually eating the fruit. If you juice something or you make an extract of it, you're not going to get the full benefit of just like eating the thing. So if you want to spend 50 bucks on lion's mane, just go buy 50 bucks worth of lion's mane, well, don't have a party, but like, you know, eat it. You can make crab cakes and all sorts of good stuff with it. It's a delicious edible mushroom. Don't think it's going to like save your brain from whatever's happening. I think you just need to get outside and go for a walk and sleep well and that kind of thing. So another great mushroom, this is probably my favorite edible out of the whole group here, is the cauliflower mushroom, Spiracis radicata. So this grows in conifers, Doug fir, and pine. Has this crazy leafy, brainy invagination, like all sorts of stuff. It's a really cool looking mushroom. It's usually at the base of these trees. It has an incredible sort of piney, lemony, high note smell that's just absolutely delicious. And you know, can come really small or really big depending on, you know, what tree it's growing on. It always fruits on the same tree year after year. So that's a good tip. If you find one year, go back and look another year. It can be used as a noodle substitute in dishes. So I've made like a gluten-free carbonara based on Chef Chad Hyatt. He's a great mushroom chef who has a book called The Mushroom Hunter's Kitchen, which if you want to learn how to cook with some of these varieties that I've mentioned, non-standard mushrooms, and do something other than just a pasta or like an omelet or a pizza, Chad has a lot of cool recipes. So I would definitely check out the Mushroom Hunter's Kitchen. And I love the way that this mushroom functions in dishes, because it really is like a noodle. It's absolutely amazing, and it's gluten-free. Dyer's polypore, this is a pretty common one. You'll see it all over the place in various stages. When it's really young, it's sort of fuzzy, nascent little thing, and when it gets old, it's a big blown out brown thing. They love to grow in Doug fir, really hard, woody, inedible, long-lived fruiting bodies. You'll see months, you know, into the summer, you can see them. But these are really good for dyeing, and you can make a lot of different types of dye and colors of fabric, depending on the pH and the mordant that you use. It's also very forgiving. So there's a lot of different natural dyes that people use, but this one, Dyer's polypore, will always make a color and always give you something, whereas many other things will only work sometimes. So I wanted to end with showing you guys some really cool pictures of guttation, which is one of my favorite phenomenon in fungi, where mushrooms are catabolic, so they're doing combustion reactions. They're breaking sugars down and creating oxygen, and they're creating CO2 and water. And so these little droplets are basically mushroom sweat. These mushrooms are growing so much that they're working so hard that they're sweating, and that's what guttation is. And I think it is just one of the most like absolutely gorgeous, beautiful phenomena in nature. And I just want to show you guys some pictures. So anyhow, thank you guys for listening to me. I'm sorry for running over a little bit there, but we blasted through the last little bit. And yeah, if you want to learn more from me, definitely check out my Instagram. I have Facebook, YouTube. I'm on Twitter. I have a Pinterest. A big one that if you like cooking or you want to hear more from me on cooking, I have a Patreon, and you can subscribe for like a single $1 per month. It was the lowest they would let me make it. And I'm going to try to post, I post recipes about 2 or 3 times a month, and I'll post more as time goes on. But yeah, I'm really excited that you guys were here to listen to me, and thanks for having me. But feel free to keep in touch, social media, email, etc. Check out my website, fascinatingbyfungi.com. I've got some cool t-shirts and original designs and all sorts of stuff. So
yeah, again, I can vouch for the fact that the Instagram is on its own very educational and very fascinating, for lack of a better word. I'm sure that's why you picked it. But it's been such a wonderful, super fun ride to just be able to go through and watch some of the things that you've been able to find, you know, a lot of stuff, you know, really close by to where all of us live. So I highly recommend, you know, giving that a follow for sure. And I haven't seen any other questions come through. So I just want to say thank you to everybody, and thanks for sticking with us a little bit past, but definitely worth it, in my opinion, at least. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you again sometime soon. We hope to have our next Wild Napa, probably not in February, but in March. Nope. Either January or March. We're going to every other month instead of every month coming in the new year. So stay tuned for more information on those. So have a great night, everybody. And thanks for joining us.
Bye guys. Thanks again.